Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. I think it's, I believe that interaction is key to progress, human interaction. And that's the reason that we have embarked on traveling throughout the U.S. to make sure that something is known about my country, and also to establish relations that will hopefully endure and be sustained. What I will try to do today is try to give you an overview of what is happening in Peru and where we are heading. We think we are doing very well, even in these difficult times that we are living in the world. I think we haven't lost our north. So we have clear objectives, a clear vision. Of course, as any other developing country, we have the vagaries of the political cycles. Also, we have heavy dependence on the rest of the world. So, but notwithstanding that, I think we are doing relatively well. So I will try to give you an overview, and I will start by talking a little bit about the political and electoral system. We have presidential elections in 2011. We have regional and local elections in October of this year. And we have come out of several years of military governments in the 70s. And then in the 80s, we restored democracy. In the 90s, at the end of the 80s, we have a hyperinflation, and then a Japanese Peruvian president came into power in the 90s, dealt with inflation and terrorism. But then at the end of his term, those who helped to deal with terrorism wanted to have the peace dividend, and widespread corruption erupted. Thereafter, there was a big fight in favor of, to preserve democracy, and the democratic groups succeeded. And since 2001, we have had a very outstanding performance. Now, as you know, we live in a complicated neighborhood. Those of you who study what is happening in Latin America know that there is an ideological divide that is growing. You have the ALBA group, which is Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Cuba, trying to impose a model, an economic development model and social development model, which is totally different from the one that the rest of us in Latin America are supporting, which is very much the one that we have the same values that you do. We believe in democracy, we believe in free markets, in free trade, in the protection of human rights, and in the protection of the environment. So essentially, we are at this point confronting two major ideological trends, and that is being reflected in the possibilities for elections. Let me tell a little bit about the political system in Peru. Peru is a very complex geography. We have, actually, we are almost 10 times the size of Arkansas, but we have the coast, which is very arid, the highlands, and then you have the jungle. And we have the second biggest share in the Amazon jungle. The Andes are as high as 20,000 feet in some areas. And the coast is very, very long and very arid. We have a very diverse population. We are 29 million people, 76% in the urban areas. And then we have several ethnic groups. Actually, this is just a summary, but we have indeed around 70 ethnic groups, quite dispersed. But mix means a mixture between Spaniards or Europeans and Indians. Also, some mix are, Afro-American and Indians. We have Amerindians. We have white population. We have Afro-Peruvian. We have Asian, and Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans. Less Koreans, mostly Japanese and Chinese. And they came in two waves. The Chinese came in the middle of 19th century. Actually, there was the first free trade agreement we had with with China, but it was related to people, not to merchandise or services. And then we have the Japanese, 2 waves of Japanese. The second wave was the refugees that were in the US. They came to live in Peru, taking advantage of their relatives living in Peru. Now, the population is distributed 55% in the coast, 32% in the Andes, and 13% in the jungle. The capital has 31% of the population, so it's a mega city. It's about 9 million people. We have a presidential representative democracy. The president is the head of the state and the head of government. Is elected by popular vote. And if is elected in the first round of election, if it gets more than 50%, very rarely, normally we have 2 rounds, and is elected for a 5-year term and cannot be immediately re-elected. The current president has been re-elected. He was a president between 85 and 90. He's the one who destroyed the country. And he was very young. He was 36 when he became president. Now he regrets those days. He went into exile, and he learned the hard way. And then he came back and became converted into a free trader, free marketeer. He believes in private investment. He believes in the private sector as the engine of development. And he's continuing with what was started in the 90s, right after he left a country in shambles. And now, we have a multi-party system, more than 20 political associations, but the key ones are, from the left is Ollanta Humala, which is a nationalistic guy, actually very close to Chavez in Venezuela. The Unión por el Perú, which used to be joined with Ollanta Humala, but now they have a split. Then the APRA, which is the current government party. It's a little bit to the center left. Then we have Perú Posible and Solidaridad Nacional, which are at the center. PPC, which is the Christian Popular Party, which is right center. And then Forza 2011, which is the daughter of Fujimori. She is also Japanese Peruvian. Actually, she's Peruvian and now American Peruvian because she married an American from New Jersey. So that's the spectrum of political orientations. Now, executive power is exercised by the government, the president of the Council of Ministers, 17 ministers in total, coordinates administration. We have 25 regions, including a constitutional province of Callao, the main port, and over 2,000 municipalities, provincial and district now. Women participation in parliament has increased significantly. Now, out of the legislative power that we have 120 representatives, there are about 30 women in Congress. A few years ago, it was only 3. In the cabinet, we have had 4 women out of 17. We have tried to increase it, but women do not want to participate in cabinet because sometimes life in cabinet is too short, and so they get rid of you very quickly. Things are not out of the liking of the party in power. The judiciary is independent and from the executive and the legislature, and we have a legal system based on civil law. Actually, we are now adopting the penal code very close to the U.S. We used to have, we didn't have oral suits. Now we have that kind of a scheme in the judiciary. The commercial code and all the others do not offer any problem, but the penal code is something that has given us a lot of problems. We have about 2.4 million cases unresolved, have been sitting there for many, many years. So 4 years ago, we decided that we are going to change the system, and we are moving to a more expeditious way of, arriving at the sentence, or whether it is, innocent or not innocent. We believe that it's very unlikely that a coup d'etat might occur in the country. And actually, we are among the countries in Latin America that really we believe that democracy is quite ingrained. Although we are not very satisfied with democracy, but more, I would say, with institutions rather than the democracy, the concept of democracy itself. So the general elections, for the presidential elections, Castañeda is leading the polls. He is, as I mentioned, Solidaridad Nacional, center-right, more center, actually now trying to flirt a little bit with the left, because normally in Peru, what will happen, has been happening and likely to be happen in the future, is that the center parties will ensure continuity and will be elected. He is the mayor of Lima. He's extremely popular. He has 80% of support after 7 years of being the mayor of the city. Keiko Fujimori is the daughter of President Fujimori. She's running basically on her father's works, because he, instead of giving, a kind of social assistance, what he did is he provided property titles to people. He gave them water and sewage, electricity and roads. And that people value more than, these conditional transfers or this kind of direct subsidies, things like that. Toledo was a president of Peru. He's of indigenous origin. And he's a very well-known scholar now. He has been at Stanford University. Now he's at Brookings. He's going to run, and he's rising on the polls. He was a president before the current administration, up to 2005. He led the democratic movement that threw away Fujimori, and especially all the corruption that surrounded Fujimori. And Humala is the person that I told you, he's from the army, and he is the one associated with Chavez. But he's coming down in the polls, especially because people are now asking him what kind of economic model is he planning to bring to Peru. And if it's the one that is in place in Venezuela, we don't want to have that. So 12.9% have not decided their vote. It's still early, but given that we have this mixture of regional and local elections in October and presidential elections next year, the political race and campaigning has already started. Now, well, I explained that. The President Garcia, the current president, has a support of 27%, and he may play an important role because perhaps APRA is the true party, political party in Peru, because they have an ideology and they have presence in all the country. They are well organized. The only well-organized party that they used to make competition with APRA was Acción Popular, that now has virtually disappeared, and the Communist Party, which also has virtually disappeared. So this is in a nutshell, the political environment. And what are the main challenges that we confront to consolidate democracy? Well, I think we have to strengthen political institutions and the judiciary, given the discontent of the people. Only 9% has confidence in Congress and 8% in political parties and the judiciary. Also, we need to enhance income distribution and encourage representatives and transparency and accountability, because majority of Peruvians still believe there is discrimination, and not discrimination in the sense of racial discrimination only, but income discrimination, gender discrimination. So a number of hard feelings in the mind of people. So we need to do something about it, and we think it could be a start. We could start by improving the income distribution. That's the only way we think that we are going to reach sustainable growth and social stability over the medium term. Well, that's for the political environment. So a lot of financial analysts, when they talk about Peru, they say there is political risk. Indeed, there is political risk in all countries. But what we confront in Peru, I think it's the likelihood of continuity of the model that I mentioned, have shared values with the U.S. is very likely to continue. Now let's move into recent economic developments, which is the other side of, people may be very unhappy about the political situation, but if their standard of living keeps improving, essentially that offsets and sometimes more than compensates their uncertainties about the political future of the country, even though you cannot split them. But I think there is a very close correlation between economic welfare and political stability. We have been doing extremely well. Between 2001 and 2009, we have grown at 5.4% per year. In the last 5 years, we have grown at 7% per year. More than any other country in Latin America, we have led the pack. And in terms of the per capita, between 2009 and 1980, we were in the 5th place. Between 2009 and 1990, we were in terms of growth of per capita income in the 2nd place. And in the last decade, we have been in the 1st place in terms of income per capita growth. That is telling you that our growth is accelerating in relation to all the other countries in Latin America on a per capita basis. That's very good news. What has led this growth? This growth has been led by domestic private investment and by sizable inflows of foreign direct investment. Actually, the data for 2009 on foreign direct investment is the 4th largest inflow in the world. Despite the crisis, we kept getting $6 billion in FDI. And that tells you that something is going on in that country. Now, the other factor that contributed to growth is labor productivity. We're spending a lot on education and health and our human capital. And also the fact that foreign direct investment is coming with new technologies and know-how. The productivity of labor is increasing significantly, more than any other country. And that explains why our growth is accelerating way above the other countries. And as you can see, during 95, 99, we were way below Chile. And everybody talks about Chile. But between 2000 and 2009, our labor productivity has increased much more than the other countries. The projections is that we will continue leading the pack. And actually, we are going to be around 6.3%. Our president announced 8%, which indeed could be the case. We don't want to do that because when I was appointed minister, we were growing at 11% in 2008. And it was euphoria. People were extremely euphoric about the whole thing, but inflation was rising rapidly. So the president asked me to come and implement a program, an economic program that would temper inflation, because he doesn't want to have hyperinflation again ever in his life. He hates inflation. So that's good. So since I contributed to the preparation of the economic program to deal with the hyperinflation, I was the person he called at this time. So it was not easy to come to a party and tell people that the volume of the music was too high. So we had to throw a little bit of cold water, and that is, it's not a popularity contest. But I took the challenge. Even though I have lived a long time abroad, I still had contacts with my Peruvian friends who are in government and also key people in the private sector. So I came and I did what needed to be done. We slowed down growth to a level that was sustainable, but then we were caught by the crisis. But fortunately, we came out with about 1% of growth last year, and now we are already running at 6.5, almost 7%. But we will lead growth. Now, we have had also the lowest inflation in Latin America, 2.5% per year in 2001, 2009. We have a spike. We have what is called an inflation target range. So the central bank, our Federal Reserve, targets inflation within a range, and they take actions as soon as the inflation deviates from the upper or the lower limit. Now, what we had here in 2008, and this is the time when I arrived, is precisely the impact of the high oil prices and the high food prices. That combined with the fact that we were growing at 11%, our potential growth is about 6.5%, That meant that we were overheating the economy, and we were dealing with an external shock of oil and food prices. Well, we have come back, and this is my doing. We came back to this. Now we are within the range, and hopefully this year we are going to have the lowest inflation in Latin America again, leading the pack. On the external side, our exports have been growing very rapidly, and, but interestingly enough, our main trading partner, that used to be the US, now is slowing down, and China is emerging, and Switzerland are emerging as the main trading partners. On the import side, we also see that here, it's very important to see this because we have a lot of FDI inflows, but the proximity of the U.S. and the capacity of the U.S. to produce capital goods actually explains very much what the fact that the share of the U.S. in the imports has increased. Now, we are bringing a lot of consumer goods that are very cheap from China, although I will explain later what we have done with the China Free Trade Agreement. But we have strong export growth. Worker remittances are also a very important component in the balance of payments. So we have sizable foreign direct investment, dynamic growth in exports, and worker remittances, mainly originating from the U.S. And that explains why we have reduced our external vulnerability. We are now stronger. We have accumulated reserves, and our net international reserves in terms of the short-term liabilities are 5 times. It means that we can pay 5 times the amount of short-term debt that we have. So we are in a very comfortable position. In terms of GDP, we have reserves, international reserves, hard currency, 25% of the GDP, equivalent to 25% of GDP. And this is a measure of external vulnerability. The red dot is the net international reserves, and the yellow and light blue is the current account deficit and the short-term debt combined. That tells you how many times you can support a shock. If there is a shock, it means that your exports all of a sudden decline, or if there is a sudden stop in the flow of foreign direct investment, you can still continue importing the basic goods to run the economy. That's what it means to be strong in external terms. Now, that's one strength. So we have, as I mentioned, strong investment, labor productivity, very strong external sector, of course, depending a lot on what is happening in the rest of the world. The variation in the price of commodities affects us, and the demand for our products, the slowdown of the U.S. and the rest of the world affected us. But luckily, we had the ability to cover the basic needs of the country without necessarily recurring to debt, to borrowing. We also have a very prudent fiscal policy, and I don't want to overemphasize this because I don't want to offend anybody, but we have been doing well. It's the first time in the Peruvian history that we take advantage of the commodity price boom. In 2006, we had a surplus of 2% of GDP. In 2007, we have a surplus of 3% of GDP. And in 2008, we have a surplus of 2% of GDP. That allowed us to confront the crisis. I introduced a stimulus package of about 3.4% of GDP without borrowing. We just pay for it with our own savings, which makes a big difference. The kind of latitude you have when you have a prudent fiscal policy, and then you have the savings to deal with the difficult situation, is something that is difficult to explain, but it's really enjoyable when you have it. I think you can do a lot of things when you have those degrees of freedom. Now, in the meantime, with the surpluses, we were reducing our debt, and today we have a debt of about 26%, external debt of about 26.6% of GDP. The only country that has a lower debt ratio is Chile, and they started to do that a long time ago. Now, So what we can say is, if you take the net international reserve position and the external debt, we can say that Peru now is a net creditor to the world because we have more reserves than what we owe abroad. So it means that we could pay today all our external debt and still have some money left. So that's extraordinary for a country that in 1990 was declared a pariah of the financial world. We owed $2 billion to the international financial institutions, $10 billion to the commercial banks. We had hyperinflation. Our revenues were 3% of GDP. It was a disaster. So 20 years later, we are in this situation, result of very strong policies, prudent policies, and continuity in the management of the country. Our financial system, again, I don't want to overemphasize this, is quite strong. It's small. Maybe small is beautiful. As you said, this institution is small, and you are growing slowly because quality is key. Well, the same happens with our financial system. We have a small and not very sophisticated system. We don't have derivatives. We have some collateralized securities, definitely. But we have very strong supervision. The profitability is quite good. And what we have here is a dollarization ratio. That means that, after hyperinflation, actually your currency people lose credibility. The currency loses credibility. People do not trust the government paper. So they move to dollars. But if you see this is what has happened recently. It means that little by little, the government is regaining credibility and people are beginning to accept the new soles. We have changed currencies many times, divided by 10,000. With hyperinflation, you have to divide the currency by 10,000. Imagine if tomorrow you divide by 100, so your $100 bill becomes a $1. So then you have to issue $1,000 bills, or $10,000 bills to have the same equivalence. But that's the impact of hyperinflation. Okay, we have gone through a number of these new currencies, and today we have a stable currency since 1990, and this is what is happening. So, again, sound policies, strong investment, strong gains in labor productivity. We have reduced external vulnerabilities, fiscal vulnerabilities, and we have a strong financial system. In addition, our commercial policy, we believe in free trade. And we have a strategy that actually is to, essentially where we want to reach is, we want to have about 90% of our trade covered by free trade agreements. So far, we already have agreements with the US, with Mexico, Mercosur, and Chile. We are expanding our treaty. Then we have recently signed agreements with China, Thailand, Singapore. Today, we are signing with the European Union in Madrid. So it's already a fact. Mexico, we are expanding the treaty, and we are negotiating with Japan and Korea at this point. Imminent negotiations in Central America, and then we have in our plans to move to Russia, Australia, New Zealand, Morocco, and South Africa. The Australia-New Zealand agreements are being negotiated in conjunction with the US. This is the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And the reason why we agreed to negotiate it jointly with the US, there are 8 countries negotiating this Trans-Pacific Partnership. Chile, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand already have an agreement among themselves. Chile has with the US, Chile has with Peru, Peru has with Chile, and Peru has with the US. There is Vietnam and Brunei who are entering into the negotiations. Why are we doing this? Because this is part of the strategy of Obama administration, that There are so many bilateral agreements in Asia that the only way to penetrate them is as a bloc. And if we really have to be very, very persevere quite a bit in terms of achieving this, breaking this, kind of bloc. And we are members of APEC, and so is the US, but that is not enough. Our presence has to be much more explicit, and we have to penetrate those markets much more forcefully. So we are now at this point beginning the negotiations. The New Zealanders are very eager to bring all their dairy products here. And that's going to be one of the critical aspects. The Australians are talking about cattle and the minerals. That's not too much of a problem. And for us, and I was going to mention very quickly two important things. We believe that the treaty that we signed with the US and entered into effect last year is the treaty of the 21st century. Why? Because it's not the one that you have with NAFTA or with CAFTA. It has two new components that no treaty of the US has had before. One is an annex on labor issues, and the other is an annex on environmental issues. The annex on labor issues is Peru is adhering to the ILO convention. The US is not. Only two conventions are observed by the US. But the AFL-CIO was completely opposed to support free trade agreements because they thought it was against their interests. Well, when we explained to the AFL-CIO what is the nature of our labor regulations, they abstained from voting against the deal between the US and Peru. Because we have much broader rights in terms of formation of unions, the strike rights, a number of other regulations that affect labor stability. Second thing is on the environmental side. It's a novelty because we were very much interested, regardless of whether we had a treaty with the US or not, to have a rational exploitation of our natural resources, particularly in the jungle. There is a lot of illegal mining and illegal logging going on, and deforestation is rising. So we were very concerned about that. The former legislative body did not allow for a rational exploitation of resources, and in addition, it didn't take into account the rights of indigenous populations living in the jungle. We have had significant social unrest. And at this point, we're about to conclude the consultation process, and we're about to present to Congress a new legislation for the wildlife and forestry law. And that's a novelty. And this is precisely what the Obama administration is after. They want to have a treaty of the 21st century that ensures that trade leads to employment generation, that there are net gains for all participants. But for that, you need to satisfy internal domestic politics. If you don't deal with that, you don't go anywhere. The other important thing is with China, we were very concerned about dumping. We could not explain in a number of cases why they could produce so cheaply. And if you go through the normal procedures of challenging the value of an import, of Chinese import into Peru, normally the information you get to make your case is given by the enterprise themselves. What we managed to achieve with the Chinese is a treaty between our customs. So now it's a responsibility for our customs, in addition to the enterprises, to provide information. That provides a double check. So they cannot tell us that something is produced at a much, much lower cost if the customs of China does not have registered similar products at the same cost. So we can use official information as well as private enterprise information. So those are the features, that's the way we are moving in this world. So again, to recapitulate, good investment, labor productivity increasing, sound policies that have reduced external vulnerabilities, fiscal vulnerabilities, a strong financial system, and a strategy to open to all markets in the world. We also have a growing array of investment treaties, which means that you cannot be expropriated without appropriate compensation. And several firms are coming, multinational firms, the largest. As you can see, the U.S. has a significant number of key enterprises, but most of them in mining. Chinese are also heavily concentrated in natural resources. But look at the list of European and South American multinationals. This is really growing. All these are operating in Peru now, and more are coming. That's the reason why tomorrow I will talk to Walmart to discuss why they are not coming to Peru. Now, not everything is rosy. We are fully aware of our strengths and our weaknesses. And we are working a lot on the weaknesses. Now, first of all, the quality of the education system. We rank very low. Very low. We're very concerned. And we are now embarked on a very strong reform. The first problem was the union was impossible. They claimed there are 440,000 public sector teachers, and the union claimed to represent them, and in fact they didn't represent all of them. So now they are quite weak. There are different organizations representing the teachers. There is a system for promotion, because before everybody had the same increase, now it's by merit. So we are moving. We are building schools. Infrastructure is relatively good. But essentially, the equipment is something that we are now improving. So hopefully, performance of the kids will increase, and there is a system for supporting, poor families to bring their kids to school. There is a conditional transfer that is used to encourage mothers to bring their kids to school, and not to have them working in agricultural tasks or things like that. The burden of government regulation, we're trying to simplify things. It's about 2% of GDP, the cost of over-regulation. Bureaucratic procedures are extremely cumbersome, and you will face that when you deal with your fundraising. I'm sure that will be a key component of the things that are preventing people from. I used to sign 300 exemptions for NGOs a month, for exempting them from value-added tax and so on. It was quite difficult, and they did not report, so I decided to have a random process for fiscalizing them. So you will encounter interesting things there. And the contributions are not tax deductible, only very minor fraction, but not like here. So if you really get a contribution for an NGO, it will be truly, out of social concern. The efficiency of the legal framework, I already mentioned the shift that we're doing to the penal code. The quality of infrastructure is something that we're working significantly. There is a deficit of about $32 billion in infrastructure in the country. And then we have rigidity of employment, notwithstanding the fact that we are ILO compliant. That doesn't mean that we have a rigid labor market, and that affects also the function of the company. So we are working on all these areas to improve the investment climate. Now, main investment opportunities that we are contemplating is agribusiness, fishing and aquaculture, mining, forestry, textiles, tourism, and infrastructure. So we have specific projects in each of these areas. I think we have a comparative advantage, especially in mining, fishing. Agribusiness is all irrigation, but we have most of the water goes to the jungle as opposed to the coast. So we are building irrigation channels that go across the Andes, and then they will help to irrigate the coast. There are areas in the coast, the one that produces asparagus and has full employment. So it's incredible. If you go to the coast, you will see, go to the north, you will see that we are producing grapes being exported to China, avocados that will soon come here, and off-season, because it doesn't, we are complementary to the California and the Mexican avocados. But we have 22 products that are still waiting authorization from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's not easy. It took us 12 years to get our citrus into the U.S. It took us 8 years to get our avocados into the U.S. So life is not as easy as it seems. It takes a long time to see, things coming. We have peppers, we have a number of things coming out, fruits, all sorts of things. And in addition, we have all this processed food, which is even a different level. But it is not for this meeting to talk about that. Now, to finish, let me talk a little bit about poverty and social development. Since we have been growing so steadily, employment has grown steadily. And even during the crisis, it grew by 1.3%. So far, it has grown by 1.6% in February, January, February. So this has changed the life of many. And poverty has declined. This is headcount poverty. Has declined from 55% in 2001 to 36% in 2008. And in 2009, it declined a little bit, not too much, because the slowdown in growth and employment growth. We have extreme poverty. Headcount poverty is $2 a day. Extreme poverty is $1 a day. Both of them have declined. But the one that has declined the most has been headcount poverty. Where are the poor? Well, mostly they are in the rural areas, and mainly in the highlands and in the jungle. And the same with extreme poverty. But you can notice that extreme poverty is not quite prevalent in the coast. This is the map of poverty incidence. Essentially, this is the region which the highest poverty incidence, and it happens to be the region in which there are remnants of terrorism. That's a place where they are growing the coca. That's a place where is the greatest social unrest. Now, we are addressing that, but it's not easy, because it requires not only dealing with the armed forces and the terrorists, but it also requires alternative development and an integrated approach. And that's what we're trying to do. It's not easy. And we thought we had completely defeated the terrorists, but now there is what is called the narco-terrorism, which is the joining of the drug trafficking and the so-called terrorists, which is actually the armed forces of the drug trafficking. And that's an area, unfortunately, this is an area where they operate. Now, we have a very successful story here in San Martin. That used to be the area, the closest to Colombia. Colombia is here. That used to be the area where we grew the most of the coca. But what happened there is, with the support of the USAID and also a number of other countries, but mainly the USAID, we succeeded in eradicating coca. We succeeded in creating an alternative development, an alternative way of living. And today, from that area, we are exporting cocoa, African palm tree oil, and also some citrus, an extraordinary growth. And perhaps that area and one in Thailand are the only two examples in the world of a successful story in dealing with drug trafficking and dealing with alternative development. Secretary Clinton was very surprised when we presented to her the developments in that area. It's something that worth investigating. And I think it's something that we are very proud of. Now, but that doesn't mean that the rest is not critical. There is poverty, as you can see. Only perhaps this area has the lowest incidence, but the rest of the countries is still suffering of a significant poverty incidence. And we are really very concerned about that. Our main concern at the main objective, doesn't mean that it's the only one, but the main one has been malnutrition, dealing with malnutrition. And we have been relatively successful. We have managed to reduce chronic malnutrition from 25% to 18%. Most of it is, most of the success is in the rural area. In the urban areas, it has declined, but not as much as in the rural areas. We are still way above many of other countries in Latin America, but we don't take, any console out of the fact that there are others that are worse than us. But I think we are measuring our position vis-a-vis those who have much less degree of malnutrition. We have increased significantly the budgetary resources to deal with social problems on a sustained basis. Actually, this was the period when I increased. This has been the largest increase that has been given recently. Not only that, but I introduced a reform of all the social programs. We reduced the social programs from 80 to about 20, because most of them were not very efficient, and we were throwing the money into a black hole. So the selected indicators of social progress, let's focus on this. Infant mortality has declined. Anemic infants 6 to 3 months has declined significantly. Children under 5 with chronic malnutrition has declined. Underweight newly born also have declined. Kids that are naturally fed, breastfed, have increased. The kids with acute respiratory infections have also declined, although we are not very happy with that. Especially in the coast, it's very humid, and it really affects a lot respiratory infections. And we are trying to improve the population that has national identity cards, so we can really identify where they are, what they are doing. Youth unemployment is something that is very serious for us. It's about 20% youth unemployment. We really want to focus on that. But as I mentioned, the main objective of the government has been malnutrition. I think we are doing something there. We have other objectives in gender. Well, all the Millennium Development Goals objectives are going to be met. Some of them already have been met. So in that area, we are not concerned. We are concerned more about what is going to be the legacy of this government for the next one. And also we are concerned about where we are going to be in 2021, which is when we have 200 years of independence. And we have established certain objectives that hopefully we can achieve. Well, this is something about internet access. We are really moving very, very quickly on internet access. The 2009 numbers are unbelievable because we have increased the network, and we just auctioned the last broadband circuits. So we are doing quite well. So this is more or less a brief presentation to give you an overview of Peru. Where we're going, Vadis, I think we're going places. And hopefully, if we manage to elect a president that will ensure the continuity of the model, I think we will continue in this path of progress. I think Peruvian society will not allow a significant modification of the model. I think we are very much frustrated with experiments like the ones that they are conducting in Venezuela and Bolivia. And I think with that, I just wanted to thank you for the attention.
Thank you. The ambassador said he would take a few questions. I know he's got a busy schedule today, so does anyone have a question that they would like to ask him about Peru or Latin America? Yes, ma'am. Let's wait for the microphone, please.
Muy bienvenido al estado de Arkansas. Yo tuve la gran oportunidad de vivir en Arequipa.
The
Hace
Republic
muchos-
of Arequipa.
Sí.
That's what we call it. They consider themselves independent.
Bueno. During the time that I lived in Peru in the early 1970s, I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the maritime sea limit by Peru was declared to be 300 miles.
200.
200, I'm sorry.
It's still 200.
It's still 200?
Yes.
Okay. And are we still having some conflict with the U.S. fishermen and or other countries whose fishermen
Not
are
really.
in?
Part of the, we have an issue in the Hague with Chile, and it's the definition of the seabed line. And that, the reason for the conflict is that at some point there was an instruction, not decree, but it was an instruction from the ministries, the respective ministries of the Navy. At that time we used to have a Ministry of the Navy. Now we have a defense ministry that brings together all the forces, that allowed the artisan vessels to cross without problems certain limits. There was no defined limit. So instead of stopping them, they were allowed, but that was just for that kind of vessel. Well, it happens that we tried to define the seabed line many times, and through negotiation, and it was not possible. So we took it to international arbitration. So now there is a whole issue of, as you know, since the world is not flat, although some people think that and have written about it, the seabed line is not easy to draw, because the only map that I have seen that is flat was a National Geographic map of the world. That is described in a two-dimension map. But then if you do that, the definition of the borders is very clear. Whereas if you do it in terms of the parallels, it comes out totally different. So that's what we are debating now. No, we don't have any problems with the American vessels. Actually, a lot of them are operating in Peru. A lot of Japanese vessels are operating in Peru. Actually, what we're discussing with the Americans is to give us some patrol boats so we can really supervise the fishing activity in our waters, because we don't have enough. And not only that, mostly the request is not to control fishing, because there are fishing permits and people are very respectful of that, but to control the traffic of drugs that is going through vessels. As you know, there are even submarines that the Colombians have built to transport cocaine. So that's the reason why we, and then the northern part is being developed for sport fishing, and very, very famous people have been going there, because we have this Merlin's fish, which is extraordinary.
Any other questions? Yes. The State Treasurer has one.
Thank you. It was very enjoyable. My question is oil production. Do you depend on Venezuela? What about your production? Do you have offshore drilling at this point? You know,
Yeah.
BP is, I think yesterday they found a solution, hopefully. So what about your oil production?
Well, we have significant, we are marginal exporters of oil. We have gas. We are beginning to export gas to Mexico and to Chile, significant amounts of gas. And then we have hydropower. And we just authorized about 500 megawatts of wind power in the north. And 2 American companies are coming, and 1 French. So we are moving, our energy matrix is moving towards a more balanced matrix. Of course, our comparative advantage is on hydropower. But we have significant amounts of gas. and petrochemical industries in the future. We are now building significant transportation pipelines, gas transportation pipelines. There is a big development of oil in the jungle, but we are still waiting for this legislation that will, in Peru, to get a concession of exploration and exploitation of resources, you not only need the government license, you need social license given by the communities, because the indigenous communities in Peru own about 100 acres per capita, plus 100 acres per capita of protected forest. All the rest is for public concessions. But if you want to drill or you want to operate in territory owned by the communities, you have to get their consent and pay them rent when you are exploring, and then share in a royalty with them once you start producing. So, the government can?
You don't have a policy where the government can take land, eminent domain?
Yeah. Yes. Well, that's what I said. We have an investment agreement that says that you cannot be expropriated without due compensation, and this is in international tribunals. So the arbitration is going to be international. We are not interested in that. Actually, we have privatized almost all the public enterprises. In the last 20 years, almost all. Petroleum Corporation is national. And is doing, we are moving very much into public-private joint activities. And primarily, we favor private investment. The government cannot generate the resources that are needed for the development of the country. And that's very clear in the mind of many, many people. So I don't have any doubts that there won't be that kind of inclination to take over. There is a debate going on now because people thought that we were exporting to Mexico and Chile without having the appropriate reserves. But now it's clear that we have enough gas reserves to export. We made a mistake, or not, I don't call it a mistake. When we first gave the license for exploration of gas, nobody else wanted to put the money to invest in that area. Therefore, what we agreed to a fixed price, and that today, at today's prices, it looks like something that is not favorable to the country. And the political parties are asking for a review of the price, a review of the contract. Now, for us, legal stability is critical. You cannot play with that. You will scare investors, domestic and foreign. So we have, when we confronted the booming commodity prices, what we did, instead of imposing what is called a windfall tax, what we did is we call on the corporate social responsibility. And we told all these companies to engage in a program in which they would allocate part of the additional profits for the benefit of the community in which they were operating. It was a very successful program. So they are investing together with the local government in areas that are of need of the community, but in their influence area. So that was a substitute for imposing a tax, but we didn't change the legal framework. Now, some people claim, well, they are responsible, but not that responsible because they are very demanding in the conditions for financing the investment projects the community wants. Well, it's their money. They have to demand certain technical criteria and profitability and return on their investment, right? So instead of paying taxes and we giving them the money, they are placing it directly, and it's a substitute, a good substitute for changing the tax laws every now and then according to what is happening in the rest of the world. So that's what we did. So we are very clear about playing games of that sort with foreign direct investment and with local investors. We don't want to scare private investment at all. On the contrary, we need it. We know clearly and why. We know why we need it.
I've got a question. You keep talking about the jungle.
The jungle, yes.
The jungle and the people living. Can you describe what you mean by life in the jungle, and how do people live, and how are services rendered, and what is?
Well,
I have a picture of a jungle.
Sure.
But I'm not sure that that's the right perception. So could you?
Well, let's put it this way. Peru is 3 times the size of California, okay? It's about 10 times the size of Arkansas. But just to give you a perspective, 3 times the size of California. The jungle is all this. So it's 60% of the territory. So it's about almost 2 times California. And there are only 3 million people living there. The main means of communication is the rivers. We have many, many rivers, Amazon being the main one, the widely known, but there are thousands of rivers. That's the main way of transportation. Then you can access it through by plane. But there are not enough airports. There are not enough ports in the rivers. So that's the infrastructure that is missing. Life is difficult. There are the main city is here in Iquitos, as the capital of Loreto. And then you have a lot of cities around here, which is what we call the lower jungle. That's where you produce the coffee, the organic coffee that just won the first prize in the US. And then here also, here you have gold, you have uranium, you have a number of minerals in this area. But to reach those places is very difficult. What is the government doing? We are about to finish a road that will go from here all the way to the border of Brazil. Brazil already finished the highway. We are about to finish. We are also building another road. It's a combination of a road joining some rivers. And then there is another one in the center, superhighway, also joining rivers. So things are going to change. In addition, we have 3 million people, of which 400,000 are truly indigenous, living in very small groups, speaking different languages, very removed from a Western style of life, with little access to public services, very little presence of government in many places. So we're trying to improve that. But it's not easy. If you tell a medical doctor, go and live here, this is where the FARC are, next to Colombia. This is where the guerrilla is taking place. Every day somebody's dead. Nobody wants to work there. No matter how much you pay them, doesn't matter. They don't want to go. So it's not easy. So people tend to move. And then there are some activities, there are some formal activities that are developing. And that's the reason why we want to encourage corporations to move. If you authorize drilling, they will set up a camp. Around the camp, some people will come to live. They will set up services. They will, create restaurants, hotels, or place to stay and places to stay. So that's what formal activities bring. If you don't intervene, and you continue allowing informal logging, informal mining, they will drag the rivers, they will destroy the environment, and they will be there until they finish their activities, and then they are gone. And this is what is happening here. In Madre de Dios, it's a disaster. And they call themselves, small miners, or small informal miners. And a small informal miner that has equipment that costs $500,000, and they don't pay a single tax. And they throw mercury on the rivers and destroy the agriculture. So the government is trying to stop that, but then you have all this, protest. They have social unrest because they mobilize the other groups. So there is, life is not easy in the jungle, but hopefully with the kind of development strategy that we have, it's not only roads, we have electricity, water and sewers, and then also expanding education and health services. We have moved into universal health care, and then we have the specific support programs, social support programs, that provides conditional transfers everywhere in the country. Most of the programs are for the poorer regions. The poorest region that I identified was here, but there are a number of poorer regions also in the jungle. You will see here. This is the jungle. You see 50 to 69% poverty, headcount poverty. That's in 2007. In 2008, it was reduced to, well, not too much. Here in Loreto, in the jungle, it was reduced because it was a significant effort to address the problem of Iquitos, which is the capital city. The whole system of water and sewerage was modernized. That changes the quality of life. But still, it's not easy.